Welcome everybody to this RSA seminar. My name is Meredith Doig. For those of you who don't know me, I'm president of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Well, tonight we unpack the religious freedom agenda. And I say the word agenda advisedly. It's really no secret that the federal government has spent nearly 2 years trying to introduce a religious discrimination bill, but everybody still calls it the Religious Freedom Bill, not the Religious Discrimination Bill. Most of you will understand or remember how this has come about. The Parliament passed an amendment to the Marriage Act that legalised marriage for same-sex people. The religious right was furious. Turnbull kicked the can down the road by announcing an inquiry, setting up an inquiry into religious freedom, chaired by Phil Ruddock. Now, what did the Ruddock Review come up with? Well, if you actually go back to that report, it came up with a couple of things. One, that Australians in general enjoy a high degree of religious freedom. Two, that religious freedom in Australia was not under imminent peril. Three, the inquiry panel, the Ruddock Inquiry Panel, did not support a Religious Freedom Act, although it did recommend that if they wanted to, the existing Racial Discrimination Act could be amended to include religious belief and activity as an additional ground or additional federally protected attribute. So if that's what the inquiry found, how come we're now imminently facing the introduction of a religious freedom bill when the government's own advice said that we didn't need it? Well, tonight we have just the people to answer that question. Reverend Dr. Elenie Poulos is an ordained minister of the Uniting Church, and she's recently published her PhD dissertation, which is called The Politics of Belief, the Rise of Religious Freedom in Australia. And Professor Marion Maddox is now an honorary academic at Macquarie University, and she's author of a number of books, but particularly relevant to tonight's webinar, a book called God Under Howard, The Rise of the Religious Right in Australian Politics, and also Taking God to School, the End of Australia's Egalitarian Education. Yes, very good. We have about an hour for this webinar, so I'm going to invite Elenie to kick off. She will speak for about 20 minutes. Then Marion will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. I would encourage you, if you have questions as we go through, please just write them in the chat box, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the seminar. So with that introduction, Elenie, can I ask you to unmute, and over to you.
Thanks, Meredith. It's really wonderful to be here tonight. I was thrilled with the invitation, and it's especially good to be here co-presenting with my PhD supervisor, Marion, on the subject of my doctoral research. So let me share my screen. And I've got some notes that I am hoping will keep me to time. So let's see how we go. All right. Religious freedom is one of those concepts that we use, assuming that we all share an understanding of what it means. apart from referencing its use in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it rarely gets defined though. And it's never just one thing, and it's used to achieve political aims. As I'm sure you've noticed, sometimes religious freedom is used to protect people from prejudice, discrimination, vilification, and violence because of their religion. And sometimes it's used to legitimise prejudice and discrimination and even violence. My PhD research examined the changing discourse of religious freedom in Australian public life for over 35 years in order to gain a better understanding of the politics of religious freedom in Australia. So I'm going to give you now a brief overview of what I found. In order to get an understanding about how the public discourse of religious freedom has changed over the years, I analysed text from 4 genres of public and political discourse. I looked at the 14 submissions from official church bodies to the 2012 inquiry into the draft legislation that aimed to consolidate all anti-discrimination law. You might remember that. That was a Gillard government initiative. I looked at all 20 public inquiry reports, from inquiries into religious freedom and inquiries into broader human rights issues that included religious freedom. And I looked at all of those from 1984 to 2017. I had the pleasure of reading all 663 parliamentary speeches given during the same-sex marriage debates since 2004, when John Howard changed the Marriage Act for the first time. And then I looked at all 40 editorials on religious freedom published by The Australian between 2015 and 2019. And just to give you a sense of the significance of that number of editorials, during that same period, the Sydney Morning Herald published 8 editorials on religious freedom, and The Age published 5. I was also interested in how religion itself was represented, assuming that different discourses of religious freedom will rest on and or display different representations of religion. And to do that, I used the work of Linda Woodhead, one of the UK's most respected sociologists of religion. And she's proposed 5 concepts or categories of religion, each with subcategories. Religion as belief and meaning, for example, a part of religion as culture, is a distinctly modern and modern Christian, particularly modern Christian Protestant understanding of what religion is. And it's what Scott Morrison expressed when he said on the 10th of December in 2019, when he announced changes to the first draft of the Religious Discrimination Bill. He said, what people believe in this country or don't believe when it comes to the big questions of life, which is really what religion and faith is all about, is such a personal matter. It's hard to imagine something more personal. So that's the category of religion as belief and meaning. Woodhead's second concept is religion as identity. It describes how religion is used by people to define who they are as individuals and groups by asserting sameness or difference. This concept of religion is particularly helpful in the context of religious freedom, because it's the claims of religious identity that, in the context of human rights, are set against other identity claims such as gender, gender identity, sexuality, and ethnicity. The fourth concept, religion as practice, could be assumed to be significant in the discourse of religious freedom. After all, the freedom to practice or manifest our religion is central to the idea of religious freedom as a human right. Religion and power is Woodhead's fifth concept. This is about the influence of religious institutions and communities and includes the power that the churches have gained because of their participation in the increasing privatisation of healthcare, social services, and the delivery of education. In 2015, Oslington estimated that churches are delivering about half of all social services in Australia, much of that funded by government, and I doubt that you would be surprised at that figure. Okay, so I took all of those texts, I took those ideas about the meaning of religion, and I put them together, and what I discovered was the development of 3 distinct discourses of religious freedom over time. Now, all of them are present to varying degrees across time, but one discourse clearly dominates in each phase. And before I look at them each in a bit more detail, it's important to note that there are 2 assumptions in the public discourse on religious freedom that are almost never challenged or interrogated. The first is that religious freedom is a good thing, except for bad religion, of course, and that's usually confined to mentions of child marriage or religiously motivated terrorism. Religious freedom is generally understood as a core value of liberal democratic society and a necessary condition for a peaceful pluralistic society. The second assumption is that religious freedom is not well protected in Australian law, but whether and to what extent this needs to be fixed as a matter of principle or to improve people's lives is contested. The first of the 3 religious freedom discourses I've called the religious diversity discourse. Developed in the context of an increasingly pluralistic Australia, it casts vulnerable religious minorities as needing improved protection against discrimination. It was the dominant framing of religious freedom from 1984 to 2010. The second discourse, balancing rights, was dominant between 2011 and 2014. It developed in the context of expanding LGBTQ+ rights, and it sees the Christian right especially begin to portray Christianity as a minority religion besieged by rising secularism. And it frames religious freedom and the associated right to freedom of expression as threatened by an imbalance with lesser equality rights. The third discourse casts belief as that which religious freedom is meant to free. And it's become a powerful tool of the Christian right and conservative political leaders and commentators to legitimise ongoing discrimination against LGBTQ+ people and undermine progressive social politics. It's now the dominant discourse of religious freedom in Australia. So, the religious diversity discourse. And on each of these slides, you'll see a little quote that exemplifies that discourse that I've pulled out from some of the material that I looked at. The contemporary public policy debate on religious freedom began in 1984 with the release of the report of the first public inquiry into religious freedom by the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board. That report and subsequent reports into religious freedom were delivered in the context of increasing migration and growing cultural diversity, September 11 and the War on Terror, and experiences of harassment, vilification and discrimination among members of minority religious groups. In this discourse, religion is understood as culture, ritual and practice, and religious freedom as the right of people to practice and express their religious traditions and beliefs. This discourse frames religious minorities as needing improved protection against discrimination and prejudice, and religious freedom as a tool for social cohesion. Christian churches are envisaged as part of the solution in this discourse, building interfaith relationships and understanding about religion, even while their privileges in law were often cast as a threat to minority groups and in need of limitation. During this phase, the churches were opposed to any further protection of religious freedom in law, largely because of the concern that it would expose them to greater risk of legal actions. The balancing rights discourse developed in the context of expanding LGBTQ+ rights and public support of those rights, an increasingly influential Christian right portraying Christianity as a minority besieged by secularism, and Victorian anti-vilification laws that were intended and that are intended to protect minority religious groups. In this discourse, religion is often understood as identity claim, usually based on a confessional understanding of religion centred on institutions and sets of authorised beliefs. Religious freedom and freedom of speech become intertwined rights that sit at the top of a hierarchy of rights. They are fundamental freedoms threatened by an imbalance in the law with lesser optional equality rights. The discourse casts religious freedom as a tool for maintaining and advancing the privilege of Christian churches, privilege which is always said to be good for society, and in the face of rising secularism. The other significant thing about this discourse is that it was taken on by supporters of LGBTQ+ rights. Not opposing religious freedom, advocates sought to uphold it alongside LGBTQ+ rights. And it's interesting to note that for policy actors and for gay advocates, this remains the discourse of choice, even though the language of politicians and the public debate has settled mostly around the third discourse. Ironically, I believe that it's this discourse of balancing rights that has served to entrench the framing of LGBTQ+ rights as a threat to religious freedom. The third discourse emerged solely in the context of marriage equality. All four religious freedom inquiries from 2015, for example, were responding to concerns about the threat of marriage equality to religious freedom. And of the 40 religious freedom editorials published in The Australian from 2015 on, 31 framed religious freedom as under threat from marriage equality. You might remember that 2015 was the year that Tony Abbott, as Prime Minister, announced that he would be looking to hold a plebiscite into marriage equality. Having reconstructed the discourse of religious freedom from a religious diversity frame to a balancing rights frame, conservative politicians, religious leaders, and lobby groups were ready to reframe religious freedom for the marriage equality debate. Belief became the defining characteristic of religion and what religious freedom was meant to protect. Freedom of conscience was added to the already intertwined freedoms of religion and speech, and freedom of belief became the weapon of choice against marriage equality. This discourse was taken up by conservative politicians and the Australians as a powerful weapon in the push against trans rights specifically, and in the culture wars more generally. This reframing of religious freedom saw issues relating to prejudice, vilification, discrimination, and harassment against people from minority religious groups almost entirely disappear from the public debate. And the Ruddock report highlighted that by drawing attention to the fact that they received very little feedback on issues around discrimination being faced by minority religious groups. By 2017, then, the idea of religious freedom and the discourse of the freedom of belief had become so powerful that they served to successfully entrench the principle of the social and legal acceptability of discrimination against LGBTQI+ people on the basis of religious belief. So just to conclude, what this demonstrates is that religious freedom is a powerful political construction subject to change for political purposes. With the rise of belief as an unassailable category of the human condition, one that ought to be protected at all costs, religious freedom is now wielded by hard-right conservative politicians and culture warriors, and by the Christian right to legitimate in law discrimination against LGBTQ+ people. It has gone from being a discourse used in support of an inclusive social agenda to one opposing it. And the concerns of minority religious groups who continue to face prejudice because of their religious beliefs and their practices have effectively been silenced. the idea of religious freedom has become reified in the public debate, naturalised as a core democratic value, indispensable for peace in our world. And all of these things immunise it from interrogation. The public debates on both the Folau case and the draft Religious Discrimination Bill centre on the extent of freedom people have to express religious beliefs which may harm or offend others, or that might otherwise be unlawful. Both cases demonstrate how dominant the freedom of belief discourse has become. In privileging the right to express a religious belief above all the other rights currently protected in law, which is what the government's draft bill seeks to do, this discourse offers little to people living with the harms caused by religious prejudice, to the woman on a train spat on because she's wearing a hijab, or First Nations people fighting for ownership and control of their sacred spaces and their sacred sites. This turn to belief then not only obscures other conceptualizations of religion and alternative discursive constructions of religious freedom, it appears to be erasing them, thereby making invisible religious freedom claims from anything other than a belief-centred framework. It's interesting to note that opponents of the draft bill appear to be using balancing rights discourse to make their case, with religious freedom and belief both having become immune to challenge on their own terms. Whether the balancing rights discourse maintains any political or policy muscle against the freedom of belief discourse remains to be seen. So I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Meredith.
Thank you, Elenie. Just a brilliant overview, and as somebody who has read many of those reports as they've come through, it's very helpful to be able to have somebody who sees the themes in them and can put them in a bit of a conceptual or a structural framework. So very, very useful. Thank you. Just before we get on to Marion, Brendan has a question which I'm going to ask now because it's directly relevant to what you've just said. He says it's a great overview of the trend and highlighting the changes of tune. Do you have any idea about what might be the next significant phase or type of discourse?
Brendan, thank you. That's a great question and one I haven't had before. This discourse of belief, I think, is so entrenched. It's going to be a long time until we see it shift again. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what Marion has to say about that, but I can't. There's nothing that I'm reading or hearing at the moment to indicate that there are any moves towards another shift of the discourse.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. But since you've mentioned Marion, perhaps we can invite Marion to take to the stage, please.
Okay, well, thank you to Meredith and the Rationalist Society for the invitation tonight. And thank you, Elenie, for that deep dive into the religious freedom story. So lovely to be presenting with you, Elenie. And thank you, everybody, really, for being interested in this very important question. First of all, Elenie and Jemana and anyone else who's worked closely with me will be very relieved to hear that I don't have PowerPoint slides. I'm not going to try and share my screen or do anything more technical than sit here and talk. So sorry about that, but you'll just have to deal with it. It would be much worse if I tried to do anything more complicated. Since Elenie has given us the detail on the religious freedom question, I'm not going to try and add to that. What I'm going to try and do is give some broaden the picture out and give some political background to how we got to this point where the particular framing of religion as belief and the way that we see religion as a political question has come to play such a prominent role in Australian politics, how we got here, and where its effects are being felt in Australian politics at the moment. This is the shameless plug moment of the presentation, where I say that in my most recent book, which you may or may not be able to see, is Charles Strong's Australian Church and Christian Social Activism, 1885 to 1917, with a group of co-authors, we look at the strands of Christian radicalism in us and how that shaped Australia's approach to social policy around federation. Australia actually has a very strong history of a radical strand of religious activism, but that's not really what we're seeing prominently in Australia at the moment. So how did this sort of very conservative strand of Christian activism become so prominent in Australian politics at the moment, and where are its impacts being felt? Meredith will give me some sort of a digital kick if I go on for too long, won't you, Meredith?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Good. So from the, like, when I was growing up, when I was becoming a first-time voter, and through my political formation, religion just really wasn't a story in Australian politics. When I did my first piece of research, which was my first big research project, was for my first book, which was as a parliamentary fellow in the Australian Parliament, and it was called For God and Country, Religious Dynamics in Australian Federal Politics. And I interviewed Australian politicians, and I'd say, I'm here to talk about religion in Australian politics. And they would say, oh, I don't remember much about that. The older ones, particularly on the Labor side, they'd say, oh, I don't think I'm going to be much help to you, love. I don't remember much about that. And to them, really, it meant one thing. It meant the split in the Labor Party in the 1950s. And the sort of the impression that bringing religion into politics had been so divisive, so damaging, had practically, you know, caused the Labor Party to be kept out of power for so many years. The feeling was that politics couldn't afford to go there. It was, religion was just this sectarian past that really everybody in Australian politics was glad to be to have behind them. And it didn't really become, religion didn't become something that started to be even regarded by specialists or by politicians or journalists as politically salient in Australia again until the Howard period. And I've written in God Under Howard about how that change happened, but the short version is that Howard perceived the major churches as being critics, as being important critics of his economic and industrial relations and environmental agenda. So he set out to counteract that criticism, and he used a three-pronged strategy. The first prong was telling the major churches to get back in their box, keep your noses out of politics, stick to spiritual matters. He never really quite spelled out what those were. And then the second prong was by cultivating an alternative religious constituency, which he did by going out of his way to join forces to be seen with the more conservative, more entrepreneurial, more neoliberalism friendly strand of the Christian churches, such as opening premises at Hillsong, addressing the Hillsong conference, talking to Danny Nalia's Catch the Fire ministries, the National Day of Thanksgiving, those sort of things, and also policy departures such as ending the new schools policy so as to favour more conservative, small Christians, low-fee Christian schools. And then the third prong was building the mainline churches into government machinery via welfare contracts for the delivery of welfare services, which is that shift that Elenie was talking about, where religious organisations are now major deliverers of welfare services, substantially funded by government, and the contracts often included specific no criticism clauses that made it harder for churches to actually fulfil the role that they had been fulfilling previously of criticising government policy. Howard never described himself when he was in office as a very religious person. In fact, he often described himself as not being a very religious person. When asked, he'd say that his Christianity was a small part of his life, not a big part of his life. And his religious positioning was not a part of a mass appeal the way that was, say, for the religious right in the United States. But his legacy was that he gave a greater prominence and legitimacy for conservative Christian voices, and he forged a closer association between the evangelical, Pentecostal and charismatic churches and the Liberal Party, and also, of course, famously, the Catholicisation of the Liberal Party. So whereas in spite of the split, there had tended to be still an association between Catholics and the Labor Party. Since Howard, the Liberal Party had 5 leaders who were Catholic: Brendan Nelson, Malcolm Turnbull, Tony Abbott, and Turnbull again. Hang on, that's at 4, isn't it? Between 2007 and 2018. And now, of course, it's first Pentecostal leader, Scott Morrison. So the areas that we can think about when we think about the ways that conservative religious, particularly conservative Christian agenda is being felt within Australian politics, and the areas that it is having an impact are in relation to the current Prime Minister and his ways that maybe he perceives the role of Prime Minister. We can't know, of course, because he doesn't, say very much about it, but we can discern bits from what he does say. Other politicians and the operation of religious currents within political parties, and Christian political activism and beyond the Parliament, and the area of policy. So with respect to Scott Morrison, what do we know, or what can we say, given that no one can see into the soul of a Prime Minister? Well, unlike Howard, when Howard was in office, Scott Morrison does describe himself as a regular practicing Christian, and of a very particular sort, and a kind that we haven't really seen in Australian politics, at least for a very long time. And he says, "I have always believed in miracles," he said at the 2019 election, and there's no reason to think that he doesn't mean that in quite a literal way, because he has described moments in his life that he thinks of as being actual miraculous instances of divine intervention, such as the birth of his daughter on a numerologically significant date. And when asked by a journalist, does that mean that coming at the end of a long period of infertility that God changed his mind? He said, "No, I don't think God changed his mind. I think that it was a message to me about who's in charge." So he thinks of events as carrying specific communication to him from God in a way that is not every religious believer thinks that God talks to them in that very specific, immediate way. He also thinks of, or at least he talks about, the office of Prime Minister in a theologically laden way. So before going into the leadership ballot, he and his close colleagues prayed from the Book of Proverbs, the verse, quoting the verse from the Book of Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 34, that righteousness will exalt the nation. And he also asked his family to pray that righteousness will exalt the nation, and explained to Nikki Sava that that if he won, that would mean that was the righteous outcome. And another phrase that he often uses is from the book of Esther, for such a time as this, which there's now getting to be quite a literature about the way that that verse resonates on the Christian right as carrying a sense of divine anointing or being placed by God in a particular position for a particular purpose. So one of my students said to me a while ago, because there was a lot of discussion in the media about how Scott Morrison was talking about how he had been placed in the role of Prime Minister to do God's work. And my student said to me, well, wouldn't any Christian Prime Minister think that they were doing God's work, or hope that they were doing God's work, or be trying to do God's work? And so I sort of had to think about what that might mean. And there are various ways that somebody might construe what it means to do God's work. And my contention is that the way that Scott Morrison talks about it is actually quite different from the ways that people who've held the post before and who come out of Christian traditions might think about that expression. So
Marion, just a couple more minutes.
Okay, well, we'll move on from that. Just thinking about other the ways that religious currents might be felt beyond Parliament, or well, beyond the office of Prime Minister. First of all, there's the role that Christianity plays in party machines, and so we've seen the Christian right positioning within the Liberal Party in Victoria, Western Australia, and an attempt in South Australia. And the thing that's interesting about that is that it's even as the electorate is secularising, church affiliation seems to be doing something for politicians, even as fewer and fewer people within the electorate, as the Rationalist Society research demonstrates, even as fewer and fewer people within the electorate identify as having a Christian affiliation themselves. So what is a religious affiliation, or particularly a Christian affiliation, doing for politicians? Well, one thing is that it gives a ready source of volunteers and potential branch members when you're trying to get the numbers. Another thing is that to a secular electorate, it gives the ability to say, I stand for something, in an era of great cynicism and increasing cynicism about politicians and loss of faith in the political process, and also breakdown in party ideology. So the Labor Party used to have the socialist objective and it used to stand for, collectivisation. Now it's looking like the other neoliberal party. The Liberal Party, on the other hand, used to stand for individual effort and aspiration and free markets, but now they want to subsidise coal mines. So, it's hard to, we talk about the convergence of political ideologies between the major parties. So it's convenient or handy for a politician to be able to say, well, I stand for something, I have values, my values are, and even if they're not immediately tied to the political game, having a religious affiliation gives them an ability to say, I stand for something beyond, favours for mates or noses in the trough, or the things that the electorate assumes that politicians are on about. David Smith at the University of Sydney published an article a while ago pointing out that even as the religious right, the Christian right, keep winning elections, they keep losing policy battles, and gave the examples of voluntary assisted dying in most of the states and abortion decriminalised in all jurisdictions. Another thing that religious affiliation does quite effectively for politicians is help them position within party machines. So as well as signalling I stand for something to voters outside, within the broader electorate, it also enables them to signal to other members of their party where they stand within the party, and also to form alliances within the party. The third thing, just to finish up, I was going to talk about policy, but Elenie's really covered what the things I was going to say there. But just a very quick remark about political activism beyond the parliament. And I have been struck, and this really comes back to Elenie's point about the framing of religion as belief. What is the thing that religious freedom is meant to protect? That thing is belief. It's not, for example, one's ties to sacred sites, or one's wearing of religious dress, or practice of religious ritual. It's believing things inside your own head. And that's where I've noticed, particularly with the religious anti-vax movement, that claiming I believe this and you can't argue with me because that's my belief and my belief is untouchable, has become a kind of hill that particularly some Christian conservatives seem prepared to fall on over, and they have framed it as a question of authority. So these declarations like the Moses Declaration and the Ezekiel Declaration that you might have come across as statements, sort of biblically framed statements about the right to not be vaccinated, or the right to not impose vaccination requirements on church attenders, are being framed as questions about who's in charge, the church or the state. And they are being seemingly this question of religion as belief, my right to believe whatever I want to, is becoming a kind of pressure point for questions about authority and who's in charge. So that's probably time to stop, but yeah, we'll leave it there.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you. I'm going to allow people to unmute if they want to, because we'll head into some questions. But if I could start off, there were a couple of questions that were sent in before, when people registered. So I'm going to start off with a question to either of you from David Swanton, who's with us tonight. And he says, the right to religious freedom cannot usurp individual rights. None of us would want that. Well, maybe not. Otherwise, a religion that required its members to harm others would have the right to do so. Very interested in hearing what they have to say. So do you agree with that individual rights, that there is an assumption, I guess, in that question that individual rights trump everything else?
Well,
I use the word trump advisedly too. In Western tradition informed by Christianity, religious freedom usually has been conceived as an individual right, and that sort of underlies the framing that Elenie's been talking about of my right to believe what I want to believe. But there are other ways of thinking about religious freedom as collective rights to practice, to conduct religious practices, or to relate to other people in collective ways. But this is probably more one for Elenie.
Yeah, okay, yes, it's a really interesting question. The international human rights system is based on the idea of individual rights. So the rights are there to protect individuals. But as Marion said, with the right to manifest religious belief, it becomes religious freedom gets associated with the right to association, and it becomes it becomes an issue of corporate rights. And of course, in the US, we've seen that being pushed into actual corporations, so into the private sector. So, for example, the Hobby Lobby case, where they claim that, you know, as a business, they have a right to discriminate against whoever they choose. The same with the, you know, the archetypal case of the wedding cake baker. But the question of harm is an interesting one, and there's been quite a lot of work done around it in the context of religious freedom. Is the question, the issue is where, you know, what is harmful? So one of the things that LGBTQ plus rights activists and advocates have been talking about is that when religious organisations are given legal permission to discriminate against them, it's harmful, and that this perpetuation of and legitimisation of discrimination in the social and legal space actually has harmful effects. But but mostly when we're talking about human rights, the idea of harm is around physical violence, and around vilification, which is, you know, includes, for example, incitement to violence, and the bar for that is generally set quite high. So I hope that is an answer to the question.
Thank you, Elenie. I've got another question from Wendy Logan, who's with us tonight, and that is, where does freedom from religion fit into the thinking of religious freedoms? And I guess this is sort of where the rationalist society is coming from as well. And that is, we've always said that we think it's fair enough that there should not be discrimination against people on the grounds of their religion, but nor should there be discrimination against people on the grounds of not having a religion. But that just doesn't seem to cut the mustard with the warriors for religious freedom. And many of us are uncomfortable with the feeling that religion is being imposed upon us. So Wendy's question is, where does freedom from religion fit in to this discourse?
Jimmy, might just step in there. It is included in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So it is there, and many Christian right activists are quick to say, oh, we're advocating for freedom for religion, but also freedom from religion. We don't want anyone, you know, being forced to do anything. So they're all very eager to let us know that they support people's freedom to not believe in religion, but it's just like other aspects of the religious freedom issue. It's been marginalised in the public space, so it doesn't get talked about very much. It gets assumed. Yeah.
Can I just add, this is also where we come back to the kind of nexus between the principle and the policy questions. So a good example is in the area of school funding, where at the moment about a third of Australian students attend private schools, and over 90% of those are Christian of one sort or another, and they have the right at this moment to, in most places, to expel students and sack staff on the basis of not adhering to the what the school has decided are its lifestyle requirements based on its religious principles. So defenders of that say, oh, well, if you're a teacher, you can get a job somewhere else. Well, you can, except that as increasing amounts of the school environment get privatised, but public money is going to support them. If you're a young student teacher going through now, where are you going to get a job? Are you going to is there going to be a job for you in the public system where your rights are protected, to not hold to the religiously framed requirements of a conservative Christian school? And that's whether you're a non-believer or whether you're just from a different religious tradition that doesn't hold to those requirements. You might be a gay Christian and not want to go and work in a conservative Christian school. Either way, as more and more public money goes into private service delivery, that is allowed to impose those kind of requirements, that question, although we might in principle say, oh yes, everybody has freedom of non-religion, that freedom actually gets kind of chipped away in practice.
Indeed. Les Allen has a question, and I might direct this to you, Marion. He says, with all the pork barrelling, the cover-ups, the disdain for the poor, the shameless marketing and so on, in your view, just how genuinely religious is Morrison?
Well, I've got some terrible news for you. Actually, genuinely religious people do some quite terrible things.
Unfortunately, his interpretation is religious.
Being religious isn't a guarantee of being a nice person, although we're one would like to think that it was. I could go on. He probably thinks that he's trying to do the right thing, but
it could be that Morrison is just using his connection to the church because it's a convenient source of many voters.
Oh, look, it could be, but I don't actually look. What do I know? I don't know, but I can't comment on the genuineness of anybody's religiosity, and nobody can. And what does that even mean? But as far as we know, he believes what he says he does. But the tradition that he comes out of is one that emphasizes individual aspiration and success more than every time I say something I think of qualifications and exceptions, but no, the short answer is I think he's probably genuine, as much as anybody is, and newsflash, horrible things have been done by very genuinely religious people, just as horrible things have been done in the name of political ideologies that sound wonderful by people who believe them seriously and were trying their hardest to do the right thing.
Do you think, Marion, that his belief in God's providence to get him where he is, and his belief that God has put him there, just means that he just sees all the things like all the pork barreling, the cover-ups, all of that as just what he needs to do to stay there, because staying there is God's will. Yeah,
possibly. I mean, that may be. We can only speculate.
Yeah, it's all speculation.
Another question that was sent in ahead of time is from Brett Waring, who's with us. Governments are expecting Facebook to constrain outrageous views, but belief in God somehow passes the reasonableness test. It seems to me this all hinges on what can be taught in exclusive schools that normalise beliefs for children. What can be done? Just a small question, Brett. Marion, any idea? I mean, my idea is that I think the Catholic Church, perhaps like in New Zealand, ought to be merged with the government sector, the Catholic sector, education sector.
With respect to school funding, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. That's also the way they do it in France. And about half of all French families use the Catholic system at some point. They're allowed to charge fees, but they only charge like very low fees, nothing compared to the fees that we're used to in the system here. And the teachers are all regarded as paid civil servants, and the schools are not allowed to impose any doctrinal tests or anything like that. So actually, in some ways, the church schools are less doctrinal than the public schools, in that we're all familiar with the hijab ban in public schools in France. So Muslim girls are not allowed to wear, or anybody's not allowed to wear any kind of religious dress in public schools in France. So in some areas, the Catholic schools are, girls' schools are 80% Muslim, because you are allowed to wear a hijab to a Catholic school. So in some ways, there's kind of more religious freedom in the publicly funded Catholic schools in the French system than there is in the public system. But
their form of secularism is much more extreme than our interpretation of it.
Well, they tell us it is, but like every system, it has its kind of hard edges, and then other areas where we look at it and go, what? Yeah.
Here's a question from Mark Weeks on the chat. Do you think that there's any element of dominion theology that's attempting to infiltrate Australian political influence? And if so, are there any international affiliations involved? I had a very similar question. Are you aware of the influence of American, in particular, religious nationalism, the movement of what it's called religious nationalism, and are you aware of any influence, and even more than that, maybe even funding or ideas coming to Australia from that movement in America?
Definitely ideas. Funding, I imagine so, but I can't give you chapter and verse. There are definitely dominionist ideas a lot in Australian Christian conservative circles. Very few people describe themselves as a dominionist. It's one of those things that it's one of those names that somebody else attaches to you. There are a few people who describe themselves as dominionists, but a lot of people talk about dominion. And if you go far enough down internet rabbit holes, you'll find a lot of Australian accents talking about the Seven Mountains and the need to conduct strategic prayer to take over government and business and education and so on. The kind of shifts that Elenie talked about, and particularly the entrenchment of belief as the thing that needs to be protected, those shifts happened similarly in American religious freedom discourse. What do you reckon, Elenie?
Yeah, I think you're right, I started thinking about how to try and get a handle on this, and how you gain evidence that this is happening in Australia. And it's not that easy. But if you've got a subscription to Crikey's done some work, I think some work on the Seven Mountains ideology that's coming through. So you could take a look at what they have to say about that. And of course, in their latest series on Scott Morrison, there are some photographs of Scott Morrison with various senators and figures from the US. So that adage, you can tell a lot about people by the company they keep, I think might have something to offer there.
We're 2 minutes over time, and so we do have to wrap this up. But just before I do, is there anybody in the audience? I've now given you the capacity to unmute yourselves. If you do have a question that you'd like to put maybe as the last question before we wrap up, would you like to just put your hand up and I can come to you? Anybody? Oh, yes, I can see somebody. Rod, please
Thanks, Meredith.
Ask your question.
Thank you. I've put it in the chat. So I'll read it from there. With powerful politicians cozying up with hard right religion, they're giving religion in general a bad name among non-religious like us, and potentially even the rest of the public who doesn't care one way or the other. Is the socially progressive religious tradition that I associate Elenie with, for instance, recognising and feeling the heat from that? I'd be surprised if you're not. And how is it reacting? What are you doing about that? And is there anything that we could be doing together about that?
Thanks, Rod. I might take it, Marion, to begin with. Yes, look, I mean, feeling the heat, I wouldn't have used the word heat, but certainly frustration. And every time that ACL comes out with a statement, my social media feed is swamped by Christians going, ACL doesn't speak for me. So there is a lot of frustration about how the Christian right have been able to capture the Christian discourse and in fact make the conservative version of Christianity what most people understand by Christianity. So there's a lot of frustration, but there are a lot of people working really hard to counter that. But one of the difficulties is getting space in media. It's always been hard, but it's a bit like media. They don't really see a story in Christians calling on each other to be kind to each, on everyone to be kind to each other. It's not much of a story, and so progressive Christians, even those working hard and working across coalition, tend to find it difficult to get any space.
Yep. Too nice.
Yep.
Elenie, you're not conspiratorial enough. Until the mid-1990s, if there was a religion and politics story in the newspaper, it was a bishop in a purple shirt sitting under a stained glass window saying, we need more social justice, we need more Aboriginal land rights, we need more environmental protection, we need better trade union rights. And then the story shifted, and I think the reason is because the ACL has 20 paid staff, and the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change has a budget of $80,000 and no staff at all. Every time there's a public issue, the ACL, the Australian Christian Lobby, cranks out media releases and just swamps the public space with them. So last weekend, when there was a not just Christian, but Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and other religious groups sounding the alarm on climate, ringing bells, holding meditations, and then the day after picketing the offices of politicians, including Scott Morrison, to draw attention to the climate crisis. That got, as far as I know, a little bit of coverage on SBS, whereas the ACL is able to get coverage in the major dailies on a regular basis. So, you've got to be a bit more conspiratorial than just that nobody wants to read about people being nice, although, there's probably something in that as well.
Shail, I think you had your hand up before. Your video's not on, but if you did have your hand up, could you unmute and ask your question? No. Anybody else? No. Okay. We are 7 minutes over time, so I'm very conscious of everybody spending time. I can see you, Brett, but I really have to wrap up now. I'm sorry. On behalf of everybody, Marion, Elenie, thank you so much. I've been in this and reading the same sort of reports that you have, but it's really put another layer of structure, which assists with understanding this journey that's happened over the last 30 years. Unfortunately, it sort of means that we've got more of a challenge in front of us. But I think it also does show that there are people within mainstream Christianity, and I presume within mainstream Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, who, like those of us who are not religious, who share a certain set of values and eschew the extremes on both sides. So I know that Paul and I worked for many years trying to bridge those gaps between the religious and the non-religious, and we need to continue with that. Just before I do wrap up, can I thank you everybody for attending tonight. We do have next month, some of you will know that one of the Rationalist Society's patrons, Dr. Rodney Syme, died recently following a short illness after a stroke. And so next month we thought we would construct our webinar as a tribute to Rodney Syme. We have two guests as well. One, Dr. Nick Carr, who's a GP, who has been really at the forefront of assisting his patients to access voluntary assisted dying, and Penny Hackett, who's the president of Dying with Dignity in New South Wales, who is trying her level best to get New South Wales across the final barrier like the rest of the states in Australia. So if you are interested in that topic, please watch out. We will be inviting everybody to join us for our webinar next month in November. On behalf of everybody, Marion, Elenie, thank you so much. Please, some claps, or you can use the little reactions button down the bottom. Thank you everybody for joining us. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.